Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jordan Diamond, and I serve as the president of the Environmental Law Institute. Am I very loud?
No.
No. Very loud to me. Okay. It is my joy and privilege to welcome all of you to the second annual Firestone Policy Forum. This is a policy dialogue named in the honor of an iconic figure in the field of environmental law and policy, Judge Nancy Firestone of the Court of Federal Claims, whom many of you knew and who left us too soon. You knew her either as a mentor or a colleague or a friend, and we are deeply privileged to have the honor of hosting this event in her memory and to continue the legacy. I will serve as the moderator of today's discussion and am thrilled to be joined by a high-level panel whose collective expertise is, quite frankly, remarkable. But before we dig into today's topic, I would like to welcome to the stage Joel Gross to give a tribute to Judge Firestone and highlight why it's so meaningful to be able to do this in her memory. For those that don't know him already, Joel is senior counsel at Arnold & Porter. Before joining Arnold & Porter, he spent nearly 2 decades in the environmental enforcement section of the Department of Justice, including serving as chief of the section for 5 years. He is an expert in many areas of environmental law, from air to water to waste and beyond. And he was also a longtime professional colleague and personal friend to Judge Firestone. So Pat, thank you to you and your family for making today possible. And Joel, and welcome to the stage. Terrific.
I need this. Is this on? Okay, thanks, Jordan. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. So on the first Monday of October 1983, 41 years ago, I had a very good day. Although the full extent of why it was such a good day, I only came to realize with the benefit of looking back. And I wanted to talk about 2 reasons it was such a good day. Although it was also, I had better eyesight back then. First, it was my first day as an environmental lawyer. After having spent about 5 years in a general litigation practice, I started my new job as a trial attorney in the environmental enforcement section of the Justice Department. And I was thrilled to get that job, but I only had the slightest sense then of my good fortune that I would get to spend the rest of my career as an environmental lawyer. I see that clearly now, not only because environmental law addresses some of the central issues of our time, but because of the rich culture that nourishes environmental law and the outstanding people who work in the field. In that regard, one indispensable organization in this space and in the practice of environmental law is the Environmental Law Institute, and I thank ELI for the opportunity to speak at this forum today. As the people I've gotten to know, that brings me back to that long ago Monday, because the very first person I got to meet as I jumped into the waters of environmental law was the amazing woman in whose memory today's forum is endowed, Judge Nancy Firestone. Now, Nancy was not a judge back then, but another trial lawyer in my new section. My initial meeting with her was fortuitous and somewhat unusual. I had been told that I would be sharing an office with Nancy, so I duly reported to that office and met this funny and disarming person who explained to me that she had been looking forward to my arrival, that we would become good friends, but that I would not be sharing her office. She explained that had something to do with protecting me from the effects of indoor air pollution. So for those who can imagine it, it's hard to believe that there was a time when smoking was permitted in federal office buildings. So we never became office mates, but we became good friends. And remained friends for 40 years until Nancy's untimely passing 2 years ago. During that time, she held a number of prominent positions in government, from Deputy Chief of the Environmental Enforcement Section to Deputy Assistant Attorney General of the Environment Division at DOJ, to Assistant Deputy Administrator at EPA, and later a judge on EPA's Environmental Appeals Board. In 1998, Nancy became a federal judge But we always viewed her, all of her friends viewed her, as still an environmental lawyer at her core. In addition, she taught and mentored hundreds of students in environmental law at Georgetown. And she did all of these jobs with incredible creativity, brilliance, and kindness, and a wonderful sense of humor. I've heard many people say that Nancy was the best colleague they ever had, the best supervisor and mentor they ever had, the best teacher they ever had, and a wonderful friend. Related to that, I'm pleased to share the news that EPA has recently created the Judge Nancy Firestone Legal Excellence Award, EPA's first national award to expressly recognize the unique contributions of lawyers and legal professionals, and particularly focus on mentoring. The award memorializes and honors Nancy's quote, contributions to legal excellence, which dramatically advance EPA's mission of protecting public health, the environment, and environmental justice. A number of Nancy's colleagues who were instrumental in creating this award are with us today, so good work. And I just learned that the first 10 of these awards were just announced today, so it's very fortuitous, a wonderful additional recognition of Nancy's contributions. So as we start today's policy forum, there are 3 aspects of how Nancy worked that I think are particularly appropriate to the sort of discussions that we look forward to, that we're all looking forward to today. First, Nancy was a great listener who understood that hard problems are much more resolved by listening than by talking. Second, Nancy always focused on the underlying purpose of whatever we were engaged in. I worked with her while we were both at DOJ. Really, they worked with her, I assisted her in 1985 and 1986 on Superfund reauthorization and how to improve a program that had gotten off to a shaky start. Nancy understood and emphasized that the enforcement and litigation components of CERCLA were integral parts of the statute, but that the overarching objective was to get sites cleaned up effectively and expeditiously. She would focus there, as in all things, on not just what we were doing, but why we were doing it. Third, Nancy had the ability to take hard problems and explain them simply and clearly. Nancy was able to boil down much of what we sought to do in Superfund reauthorization in 4 words: clean up first, litigate later. Although maybe 5 words if clean up is 2 words. So, her successes in getting some of those ideas part of the 1986 SERA reauthorizations made Superfund a much better program over the last decades. And that's just one of the many, many, many things that Nancy made better. So let's keep in mind these 3 things that Nancy taught us, among many others: to be a good listener, to understand the purpose of what we're doing, and keeping it simple as we begin the 2024 Firestone Policy Forum, the road to equitable and sustainable EV infrastructure. Let's thank Nancy's family for making this forum possible. And I appreciate the opportunity to share some memories of my dear friend, Nancy Firestone.
So thank you very much, Joel, for your touching words about Nancy and for highlighting so beautifully why this event is held to honor her legacy. We will now turn to today's discussion. Our theme for all of today's events, from the forum through to our award dinner, is sustainable transportation, and both the opportunities and the challenges experienced in the transportation transition. This is why we're extremely excited that today's conversation, maybe a little bit of debate, will focus on the road to equitable and sustainable EV infrastructure. Now, we know that transportation is a large piece of the greenhouse gas emissions pie, and as we work towards achieving national carbon neutral economy goals by mid-century, we know that there's increasing awareness, incentives, and regulation concentrating in this space. Federal and state governments are issuing regulations and offering incentives to encourage greater zero-emission vehicle adoption. Focus is growing on ensuring that our infrastructure can support this shift and more. Electrification of vehicles substantially increases electricity demand, and at the same time that new renewable energy generation is coming online, the changes are taxing our aging electricity grid. There are also questions swirling around charging access that depend on density, housing type, income level, and many other factors. It's not an easy space. So today's panelists are here to converse about the current legal and policy landscape, how we got here, where the opportunities and challenges are, and where we might go now. They will tackle questions around what infrastructure is needed and how to plan it, how to balance factors equitably, how and when various incentives are or aren't effective, and much more. One of ELI's strengths is bringing people with wide-ranging perspectives together to discuss hard topics with candor, in good faith, with facts at the ready, and looking towards the future. And that's what we are looking forward to today. The format of today's discussion is fairly simple. So I will introduce our speakers, who will then give kind of brief opening remarks. Then I will pose a series of questions for the group to answer and discuss and possibly respond to each other about. And then we'll open the floor to questions and comments from all of you from the audience. Just a note, we will have handheld mics when it does come time for questions. We do appreciate if you actually wait for the mic, introduce yourself and your affiliation before you pose your question. Okay. And now I will begin. I'm going to introduce the panelists one by one, because honestly, if I introduce them all in a row, it's not quite possible to pay attention for that long. So I'm going to introduce each speaker one by one, and then they will give their opening remarks. And we're going to begin today with Andrew Wishnia, who's partner at Epic Works Advisors and senior advisor to LSM Partners. Andrew previously served as the first ever Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate Policy in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy at DOT. In this role, Andrew was a principal architect of the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, including authoring, negotiating, and implementing the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure and National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program provisions that totaled the largest federal investment ever in EV infrastructure, EV charging infrastructure. He also established DOT's vision for the U.S. National Blueprint for Transportation Decarbonization and co-designed the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. Andrew has also previously served in both the U.S. House and Senate, the Federal Highway Administration, and held leadership roles in the White House Council of Environmental Quality under the Obama administration. So Andrew, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I feel like this is Cynthia's show, so I want to keep my remarks brief here. But maybe just a small chapeau as to how we got here, so we can have a discussion as to where we are and where we want to go moving forward. In 2015, the law of the land for infrastructure policy was a bill called the FAST Act, Fixing America's Surface Transportation. And I was handling technical assistance as a career staffer way in the bowels of an agency called the Federal Highway Administration under the purview of the U.S. Department of Transportation. And there was a provision that was sent over that the Senate wanted to create what were then called alternative fuel corridors. There's no money attached, but they were designations for natural gas, hydrogen, propane, and electric vehicles. And I took a look at that provision and I said, if we are able to designate corridors, why can't we fund corridors? And if we can fund corridors, why can't we put charging infrastructure in corridors? And I spoke to a lot of folks that were a lot smarter than me, and they said there's no reason why we can't. We've never done it before in United States history. But there's no reason why we can or why we shouldn't. So I took that idea, and under the stewardship of then President Obama and the Council on Environmental Quality, we issued an executive order, 13693, which at the time had the most aggressive electrification goals in the world, 100% electric vehicles for the US federal fleet by 2025. When that was successful, I said to myself, if we can't just do it, if we can do it for the US federal fleet, why can't we do it for the rest of the country? So I spoke to Senator Carper, who then was the ranking member of the Environment and Public Works Committee, and he asked me what I was interested in doing. And I said, if it's okay with you, with your permission, I'd like for you to create the first climate title in an infrastructure bill in American history. And at the centerpiece of that climate title, I think we ought to expand the definition of infrastructure to include EV charging infrastructure, by the way, to look at broadband infrastructure and data infrastructure. But I think that we're operating in an anachronism of the 20th century when we should be looking forward to the 21st century and beyond. So under Senator Carper's leadership, we created the Clean Corridors Act in 2017, which became what's now known as the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Program in the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. $7.5 billion to change the world, to deploy what is going to be tantamount to at least 500,000 chargers across the United States. This is the beginning of the story because we're only 3 years in, and there's a lot of perseverating in headlines about how much more work we have to do. Of course, we have a lot of work to do. The interstate system wasn't complete until the 1990s. And I think we're going to hear today about visions and challenges and opportunities related to equity in particular, and we've got a ton of work to do there. But recognizing where we started and where we have to go feels like part of creating the right sort of storyboard to figure out how we want to deploy charging infrastructure that's convenient, accessible, reliable, and above all, equitable. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Andrew. Our second speaker will be Rob Gramlich, founder and president of Grid Strategies. Grid Strategies is a DC-based consultancy focused on transmission and power markets for a reliable, affordable, and sustainable power system. He previously co-founded just a few organizations, Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, Working for Advanced Transmission Technologies, Advancing Modern Power Lines, the Macrogrid Initiative, and the Future Power Markets Forum. He has been invited to testify by both parties before Congress, FERC, and state agencies, and has earned awards from FERC as Exemplar of Public Service, the Energy Systems Integration Group for contributions to market design and transmission planning, the Hill Magazine for lobbying, and the American Wind Energy Association for technical achievement. Rob previously oversaw transmission and power market policy for the American Wind Energy Association as SVP and interim CEO, served as economic advisor to FERC Chair Pat Wood, and was senior economist at PJM Connection. Rob, over to you.
Thank you, Jordan. Thanks, everybody. It's great to be here. You might wonder, why is a power sector person on a transportation panel? And I was wondering that myself, to be honest. On the prep call, it became clear that, well, to electrify transportation and power these electric vehicles, we do need to make sure we have the power infrastructure to serve them. And so that is what we do at Grid Strategies. And we often get this question recently about, can we even just keep the regular lights on, because we have suddenly extreme power demand growth. After about 25 years where total power demand in the country was pretty much flat, you know, energy efficiency works, turns out. LED light bulbs and TVs and other things really flattened out the power demand. But now data centers are a huge energy users. All this manufacturing that's now coming back to the country, some of those are very big energy users. Electrifying EVs and electrifying heating in particular. All of these are conspiring together to really raise our power demand. So can we do it, and can we do it cleanly? I think the answers are yes and yes, but, a very big but, there are some real challenges. You really have to operate and plan the system differently. One thing that the industry was already working on was resilience, and we obviously have extreme weather situations, hurricanes, droughts, wildfires, all these things affect electrical infrastructure. One thing that we see happen is some severe weather or polar vortex or heat wave we'll take out a bunch of generation. Well, it turns out we end up shipping 10 or 15% of that region's power from the neighboring region to save the day. When the generation goes out, transmission comes in and saves the day. So interregional transmission was already an important priority. We like to say that we need a grid that is bigger than the weather. When these weather patterns are there, we can ship the power in. So that was already something we were working on. We also have old assets. Turns out most of the electrical infrastructure is 50, 60, 70 years old. We also, like most other sectors, had supply chain problems. So if you want a high voltage DC converter station, you can get in line now and you can get your shipment in 2033. So it's, it's hard to get all this stuff built on a timely basis. And then, of course, renewable energy and clean energy and climate goals were causing a new look at transmission. There is no transition without transmission, as we say, and that's largely because the wind and solar resources are usually not right where the people are. If just think about the city limits of Washington, D.C., there's nowhere near enough renewable power, but there is a lot out in other areas. You need transmission to bring it in. Moreover, the wind is always blowing somewhere, so when you connect up different renewable resource sites and solar in different time zones, then you can get a much more reliable supply that serves more of the 24 hours a day that you need. So we were doing all that. Now, in a room full of lawyers, I should say something about law. The Federal Power Act is really critical to making a lot of this happen. FERC, over on 888 First Street, where I worked for about 8 years, has very strong authority, but not everybody interprets it that way. It was basically originally to fill the so-called Attleboro Gap, where two states were next to each other and there was a gap between them. And so it was kind of a backfilling, gap-filling agency originally, but the language of just and reasonable rates is quite strong, and so anything that affects or causes just and reasonable electricity rates, you can do a lot of work with that. So FERC has done a number of nationwide rulemakings. I was there for some of them in the late 90s and early 2000s. And just recently, we were very involved in what is now known as FERC Order 1920, which is required regional transmission planning, taking into account all the public policies that states have, et cetera, proactively looking into the future for reliability, load growth, and the clean energy goals. And I think that order will have a very big impact. It is now going to the Fourth Circuit, and we'll see what they say about it. But I think if the Federal Power Act holds up strongly, we'll be in very good shape. If it doesn't, we won't be in quite so good shape. Which brings me to, and I'm just about out of time, but the Barrasso-Manchin bill in Congress. You might see some news about the permitting bill. I'm one of those in the camp who thinks, well, look, pretty much the fossil infrastructure is largely already built. And so if it's, and all the clean energy infrastructure is yet to be built. And so if we err on the side of making things easier to build, guess what? That's how we're going to clean up the system. That's actually how Texas is the leading renewable energy state in the country, because it's very easy to build there. So ironically enough, when you make it easy to build stuff, you're going to get a lot of clean energy, and you're going to displace the dirty. We talk a lot about carbon, but we should talk about criteria, pollutants, and public health. And we've seen in a number of cities, Houston, LA, New York, Chicago, other places where you have peaker plants, dirty peaker plants that were built too close to disadvantaged communities. Well, you can close those plants if you have the clean energy brought in through, guess what, transmission. So again, you need to permit the transmission and figure out who pays for it and get it built. So I think for environmental justice, for public health, for climate, we need to really start putting policies together to get more infrastructure built, which again, yes, I think we can do it, but there's a lot of change that needs to take place to get that done.
Okay. Thank you, Robert. And now we will switch gears a little bit to some of the folks managing from the other side of how this transition is taking place. So our third speaker will be Jeffrey Page. Jeffrey is Senior Attorney of Government and Regulatory Affairs at FedEx, where he advises and represents the company on environmental compliance and sustainability matters. He's a 2023 Leadership Council and Legal Diversity Fellow. He joined FedEx in August 2022 after almost 15 years of federal environmental practice experience with EPA and the Department of Transportation. During his federal career, he worked on environmental media matters and aviation issues. He received his undergraduate degree in economics from North Carolina A&T State, a master's degree in public policy from the Ford School of Public Policy at UMich, and his law degree from Rutgers Law. And Jeffrey, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. For those that are not in DC, I hope you recognize, or not from DC, I hope you recognize where we are. We're close to the National Zoo. FedEx was a proud transporter of the pandas from China. I will say I checked in with them to see if they would make an appearance, but it's a little above my pay grade, and they were busy. So with that said, happy to bring an industry perspective to the challenges that we are facing. FedEx has a goal to be carbon neutral by 2040, and that encompasses all our operations. We have over 700 aircraft, 215,000 motorized vehicles, and we operate in 220 countries. So that's a large footprint. So with that in mind, one of the things that we do is to tackle this, we try to approach it from a practical standpoint. So we have developed a three-pronged approach to addressing this. And the first prong is decarbonize what we can, which means minimize our emissions where it's possible. Second, we want to co-create with purpose, which that means engaging our key stakeholders in policy development so we can work together to find a solution. And third, we want to recognize that reducing our emissions will not get us to our goal. So that means we have to neutralize what's left. And that means we have to look at things such as carbon offsets and our investment with the Yale Natural Carbon Capture Center. With those three things in mind, we also have three questions that we use to guide our approach to sustainability. First question we ask ourselves is, how can we operate more efficiently to achieve our carbon neutral operations goal? Second, we ask, how do we foster innovation and investment in today to inform tomorrow's climate solutions? And finally, we ask, how can we empower our customers with the tools and resources they need to achieve their own sustainability goals? So this is a holistic approach to trying to tackle this problem. If you give me 1 second, I know we're here to talk about EVs, but I do want to talk a little bit about aircraft. We recognize that that is the biggest challenge for us, and that is the bulk of our carbon emissions. But with that said, we also plan to fully tackle the EV issue as well. So what we've developed, again, is a practical approach, and it's going to be a phased approach. And by 2030, we intend to purchase zero tailpipe emission vehicles for our own pickup and delivery vehicles. By 2040, we aim to have all parcel pickup and delivery vehicle fleet zero tailpipe emissions models, including for our contractor transportation. So with this, we have developed a very practical approach with a phased target deadline to try to tackle the goals that our carbon neutral goals. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jeffrey. And from a slightly different perspective, more from the manufacturing side, our fourth speaker will be Cynthia Williams, Global Director of Sustainability, Homologation, and Compliance at Ford Motor Company, and the 2024 recipient of ELI's Environmental Achievement Award, which we are very excited to give her in just a few hours. Cynthia plays a central role in Ford's efforts to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 and lead the automotive industry's transition to electric vehicles. She joined Ford in 1992 as part of the Ford College Graduate Program in the Automotive Emissions and Fuel Economy Office. Since then, she's held several positions at the company, including Sustainability, Environment and Safety Director in Asia Pacific, Automotive Safety Assistant Director, Environmental Policy Manager, and Onboard Diagnostics Compliance Manager. In addition to her current role as Global Director, bachelor, Cynthia serves on the board of directors for CalStart and Veloz, nonprofit organizations working to develop and promote clean, efficient transportation solutions. She also serves on the Michigan Governor's Council on Climate Solutions, the Women of Ford Board, and the Torch of Wisdom Foundation, and is committed to mentoring the young engineers, peers, and youth who will step up to become the next generation sustainability leaders. So, Cynthia.
Well, thank you. Appreciate being here with all of you. At Ford, we have a simple process as well, similar to some of the things that FedEx mentioned. But Ford has been in the automotive industry and leading the revolution to drive change for over 120 years. And I've been with Ford for 33 of those years. Since I've been there, we've always had a sustainability plan. And that's something that's been really key to me staying there as long as I have been, because we've always had a plan. And we work directly with our research and advanced engineering team to not only have a plan, but have science-based targets to back up that plan. That's been crucial to me in terms of why I've stayed so long and why I've continued to push the team further to make sure that we can get to the goals that we're achieving. Our goal is to become carbon neutral no later than 2050. And as part of that plan, we have a three-pronged approach as well. Our goal is to reduce 95% of our CO2 emissions by attacking our vehicle that we build, our facilities, and our supply chain. We realize touching our supply chain, it goes further than others, but we realize the reach that we would have, the significant reach that we have by sharing best practices and making sure that they can get to their carbon neutrality goals as well. And looking at the vehicle piece, one of the reasons why we chose our approach is we chose to electrify our most iconic vehicles. So we have the Mustang Mach-E, we have the Ford F-150 Lightning, and we have the E-Transit commercial vehicle EV. We chose those vehicles specifically because we know those customers. We know what the customers love about those vehicles, and knowing what they love about those vehicles, those are features that we actually built into these electric vehicles to get more people moving into the vehicles. Because if we can get people in there at scale, we know the impact that Ford Motor Company can have. And so we've been working wholeheartedly to push that envelope. We're setting up. We're not only looking at how we build products, but what we build, but how we build the products. So we want to make sure that we build a responsible supply chain. We want to make sure that the raw materials that we're building are responsibly sourced, and we're also looking at the way our teams respecting the human rights of everybody that works for Ford. And that's key to us. We shored up a new team. I have team members up front there that's leading that effort. But we go down to the mine site, not just to understand how these minerals are being processed, who's working there, are their goals aligned with the Ford Motor Company goals. Those are some of the things that are near and dear to Ford's heart, and why we push so hard, again, to be a sustainable company and bringing others along with us. We know we have a lot to do, a lot of work to do, but we are here to make sure that Ford meets our goals. We set up interim goals for 2035 for our facilities. We plan to use 100% carbon-free electricity by 2035. And part of that is making sure that we can use the responsible materials in our products and use less natural resources to build our products. And we're setting up an entire manufacturing ecosystem that we can make sure that we're reusing and recycling material. Again, we want to use as less natural materials and recycle what we can, and so that we can, again, build a sustainable future for electric vehicles. But we're here to make sure that we'll continue to push to meet those goals. And we meet with our research and advanced engineering arm on a weekly, sometimes more than weekly basis, to make sure that we are attacking the strategies that we're bringing all new technology in to make sure that we can meet these goals. Another thing that we're doing is making sure that we're bringing in different technologies like vehicle-to-grid technologies to make sure that we can not only help the grid situation, we can give back through that type of technology. So we're working really hard at Ford Motor Company, and we're here to make sure that we meet our 2050 goals.
Thank you, Cynthia. And our fifth speaker will be Bea Spiller, Fellow and Director of the Transportation Program at Resources for the Future. Prior to joining RFF, she was lead senior economist at the Environmental Defense Fund, where she worked for almost a decade. She's also a board member for the Association of Environmental and Resource Economists. Bea is an energy economist with experience working on electricity and transportation issues. During her time at EDF, she participated in many electric utility proceedings in New York and California with the goal of ushering in a cleaner, more efficient, and equitable energy system. She also has many years of experience working in the transportation sector. Her more recent efforts have focused on electric vehicles and environmental justice, exploring some of the most pressing issues around electric car, truck, and bus adoption. Her publications range across the energy space with a large focus on identifying environmental, community, and health impacts of renewable energy resources and energy policies. Bea?
Well, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. For those of you who are not familiar with Resources for the Future, we're an environmental economics research organization that conducts nonpartisan and non-advocacy-based research to help inform decision-making around climate change issues. So within the transportation program, we're really focused on how do we achieve a decarbonized transportation future through effective policy making. And, you know, equity really comes to play a big role in this question. So we've been thinking a lot about the issue of what does an equitable infrastructure investment in charging stations actually mean. And the way that I sort of like to think about it is that, you know, I think we are sort of on the cusp of a third industrial revolution. And so if we think back to the last industrial revolution, beginning of the 1900s, and how we really built that future on the backs of the poor households, on the back of Black and brown communities, right? We ushered in a future built on cars by tearing down communities of color, building highways through them. So what does that mean, right? When now all of a sudden we're at a point where the federal government has billions of dollars to spend on these investments. Are we going to take a similar approach as we did at the beginning of the 1900s and do this with just the thought of let's get those charging stations built as quickly as possible to usher in this decarbonized transportation future? Or are we going to take a more deliberate approach where we ask how can we actually achieve this goal of a decarbonized future, but at the same time reducing inequities and making sure that these investments are not exacerbating the inequities that underserved and overburdened communities face. So what does that mean really? And like over the summer we published a paper asking this question specifically. And the way that we sort of think about it is by taking using a framework from social justice. So social justice has sort of different core tenets of justice, right? One of those is distribution justice. What does that mean? That the benefits and costs need to be distributed equitably across all communities. So in the setting of charging stations, I think it's very frequent that people say, oh, distribution justice, 40% of all charging stations need to go into these disadvantaged communities following the Justice 40 goals of the Biden administration, right? But unfortunately, that doesn't get us there. Because if we really think about all the distribution of costs and benefits associated with these investments, we have to go beyond just where these charging stations are placed. We have to think about things such as much more broadly accessibility. Are these charging stations placed in places behind paywalls? Are they able to be charged? Do they work? We know that the reliability of charging stations is much lower in underserved communities. There's higher rate of vandalism. They are just not taken care of by the owner and operator, and so they're just sitting there. They're not able to be used. So having a charging station that doesn't function in one of these communities is benefiting nobody. The other issue is affordability, right? And this raises another really key equity issue in that higher income individuals and white communities tend to have garages, right? In which case they can really benefit from off-peak charging, really cheap prices. But the rest of the society doesn't have that option, and so relies upon public charging stations, and the price there is going to be significantly higher than what you're paying at home. And so you have this existing inequity that individuals who rely upon public charging stations are going to be paying a lot more for charging their vehicles. So by thinking about these issues, we don't just land in, let's just put 40% of the charging stations in these communities, because there's also ways in which having these chargers in those communities could exacerbate inequities. Is it increasing traffic to those communities, right? Is the charging there actually relying upon dirty energy and thus powering dirty fuel power plants to power on, and then, exacerbating the inequities that we face in terms of air pollution exposure? So there's a lot of things that we have to consider, and quite frankly, right, just placing these charging stations in these neighborhoods where people do not own EVs, how do they benefit? Right? So we really have to think about how these communities are benefiting from having these charging stations if they themselves don't own EVs. It does raise the other question of how do we boost EV ownership in lower income and black and brown communities. It's a separate but very much intercorrelated issue. And the final thing I will say is another really important tenet of justice, procedural justice, right? So procedural justice requires that communities have an active central part in the decisions of things that affect them. So we're thinking about making these investments in these communities. Are we elevating the voices of the individuals who live near there and who will be affected by those charging stations, who will then, maybe not have a parking spot, right? Maybe they're concerned about gentrification. Who's owning these charging stations? There's all these questions that require communities to be able to have a voice, and they generally do not in these decisions. So I will pause there, but happy to keep discussing about these issues about equity and charging station infrastructure investments.
Thank you, Bea, and thank you to all of you. So we just got kind of an opening walkthrough. Andrew, you gave us kind of the context of where we currently are in our policy state. Rob, a little bit of the glimpse of the challenges from the electricity and transmission sector. We heard from the logistics sector trying to transform their own operations, to the auto manufacturing sector trying to transform an entire market. And Bea, thank you for highlighting some of the challenges at really the intersection with equity. So now I'm going to throw out some questions to start a little bit more of a conversation. And we might start off with, Andrew, where you started us off with. You mentioned the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. We've seen dollars flowing to states through programs such as the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program and others. What have you all seen come out of these programs to date, and this and some similar programs? What have you seen happen to date, and what are you thinking is going to happen next?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think you can immediately hear and see some of the tension that policymakers are trying to adjudicate in real time as we move forward. The tension between moving, too fast and not fast enough. Not fast enough because, electric vehicles are necessary, not sufficient, but necessary to meet our Paris climate commitments and our commitments to do right by overburdened and underserved communities, and not too fast because we have to make sure that we are deploying charging infrastructure in a way that rights the sins of our past. It's absolutely true that we bulldozed communities in the 1950s and 1960s and committed a number of other sins that we don't want to repeat. That said, here's where we are today. as soon as we passed the bipartisan infrastructure law, we didn't just begin to deploy chargers. We started to put architecture around a framework for deploying those charging infrastructures. Part of that architecture was BABA, otherwise known as Build America, Buy America. So all of those chargers are, henceforth going to be made in America, which creates some supply chain concerns. But for labor and workforce purposes, that was an overlay that was incredibly important and critical to the president to see this into law. So that was one enormous industrial change, not only, by the way, as it relates to EV charging infrastructure, but all surface transportation programs have Buy America provisions. You also heard minimum standards. The EV charging programs, actually, one of the reasons why it was perceived to be slower, and we can get into the nuances on that front, because the waterfall of EV charging infrastructure programs relative to other programs is not slower, but that is the perception. But one of the reasons why it takes the time that it takes is because we had to promulgate regulations on minimum standards. Some of those minimum standards have to do with reliability, at least 97% uptime, for example. So we want folks to have the same user experience when they're using an EV charger as when they're using a gas station. It needs to be convenient, accessible, reliable, and above all, equitable. So we're starting a regime where the minimum standard has to be at least 97% uptime. There are spacing standards. There are disability standards. There has to be an accessible pathway to go from the charger to the front of a facility. These are designated as Justice 40 programs, where it's not 40%, but it's at least 40% of every covered program has to benefit overburdened and underserved communities. That means that the chargers can be deployed by minority and disadvantaged business entities. That can also mean location, that can also mean accessibility. I think where we're going to struggle going forward is creating wealth opportunity for as many EVSPs as possible. Just to answer your question with that in the background. We represent now, as a consulting firm, a large number of EVSPs, electric vehicle service providers, who want to take advantage of these programs. But it is harder for up-and-comers to take advantage of these programs for a lot of different reasons, including the fact that they just don't have the capital to make public charging financially beneficial. So I think, one of the things we ought to consider going forward is how we can expand opportunity, not just insofar as the location of the chargers is concerned, but insofar as who's actually deploying them and how they're reaping benefits from this new economic sector.
Thank you, Andrew. Any other comments?
Just to add to that, I think one of the things that the Inflation Reduction Act did do is put in, guidelines about providing equity and putting the charging stations in low income and disadvantaged communities. That to me was huge as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, and I think it's going to go a long way in the future. And it may not, the charging stations may not get as much traffic initially, but as more and more vehicles get out there, I think that definitely they will benefit. And as people travel along corridors, we're always looking for a place to charge, and I think they will benefit.
So Cynthia, let's maybe stay on this question of pace for a moment. How do oscillations in the deployment of charging infrastructure, just curious, how do those affect auto manufacturing?
Well, for companies like Ford, I think it doesn't have a huge impact on the oscillations that ebb and flow, because that's something that we have to deal with, whether it's charging stations or consumer demand and things like that. So we're building more and more electric vehicles all the time. And I tell you, we have plans out for 5 years. We look at how to flex between building to capacity and also looking at consumer demand. So that's something that we're watching and looking at every day. But looking at our Q2 and Q3 results, huge benefits for the F-150 Lightning as well as the Mustang Mach-E. In Q2, our Mustang Mach-E sales grew 77%. So they are growing. They may not be growing as much as we thought they would be in terms of the entire industry, but they're growing. And so we're implementing programs like the Ford Power Promise that you may have all saw in the news lately. But programs like that we initiate to not only help bring consumers along, but this will actually provide consumers with a charging unit as well as providing help installing that unit. So we're trying to make these different things available to customers to bring them along the journey with us.
Sure, I add it. Regardless, FedEx, we operate a number of vehicles that are different classes. So regardless of the vehicle class, you need the corresponding infrastructure, charging infrastructure there to secure the successful transition to a full-on EV fleet. One of the things that we continue to do is we continue to install our own charging stations as we deal with the infrastructure issues. And we do this globally. We do this here, Canada, UAE, the UK, and this is all in an effort to support our electrification of our fleets to ensure the greater EV adoption.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. So as you talk about kind of your own chargers, and we're talking about the deployment in various areas, Rob, you touched on it can be very hard to provide the electricity for these chargers. So let's maybe turn to the electricity sector for a second, and including the question of pricing and how, whether it's a public provider or a private provider, this is obviously a very important question. So maybe Rob and Bea, you both, as our economist and our electricity expert, what effect does pricing have on EV infrastructure deployment?
Well, I think, electricity pricing is really key here when we think about public charging stations. The challenge is that the public charging station operator is going to face an electricity price. It's usually going to be some sort of commercial a commercial rate, which likely includes a demand charge. And so if you don't know what a demand charge is, the way that it would work is you get charged for your maximum demand regardless of how many times you actually hit that peak. What that means for a public charging station operator is that, let's say you only have 10 vehicles come to visit your charger in 1 month, but 7 of them show up at the same time. You're going to pay for that, the total maximum demand of those chargers, those vehicles all charging at the exact same time, even though you don't have a lot of vehicles coming in and out of your charging station every single day. And so what that means is that the marginal cost for you as the charging station operator is going to be really high. So what does that mean, right? As more throughput, I think you alluded to this, as you have more and more vehicles coming in, the demand charge starts to matter less. And in fact, if you have a lot of throughput, demand charges can actually be pretty good because your marginal cost is a lot lower than if you didn't face a demand charge. But I think the challenge is really in the first few years when you don't have a lot of throughput. And there's this tension where if you charge too high of a price, you could discourage charging. You want to encourage charging. But if you charge too low of a price, then you're going to be losing a lot of money. And so we are seeing sort of broadly, charging stations are not very profitable. For the most part, they're not profitable. They're losing a lot of money on the operations because they're paying these high demand charges. So there's been attempts to restructure that, get rid of demand charges for public charging stations, and each utility is sort of doing it separately on their own. But I think one thing, and I'd like to hear Rob talk a little bit about this, is sort of the role for us to incentivize not just the installation of these public chargers, but also the co-location of storage and solar to help keep these maximum peaks down. You can sort of rely upon the battery at times of high demand. And that not only reduces the cost to the operator in terms of the marginal cost of operating, but also reduces the impact that you have on the grid, reduces your upward pressure on electricity prices for everyone, which is, effectively a cost shift, particularly for communities who don't own EVs and thus are not participating in that.
Yeah, so first of all, in the power sector, we kind of separate, there's generation, transmission, distribution. This is really more about distribution, which is the local utilities, usually under the oversight of a public utility commission. And again, for the lawyers in the room, there's sort of a whole body of public utility regulatory law. Most states are pretty similar, but not always. So people tend to focus on one or two states, which becomes a little bit hard for the industry overall because you have to go deal with 50 different states in their 50 different ways. First on the solar and storage, that can help reduce your peak to the extent there's a demand charge. But the power density of the amount of electricity you really need there is very high relative to what probably the likely area of a PV array. So that's going to be tough. I think it is going to be the case, therefore, that the demand charges and the pricing are going to matter, and also just kind of how the new hookups are done. Sometimes utilities, we see this on the load side and the generation side. There's always a question of how specific are you about each individual new user's contribution to the system needs. Do you give them basically a simple flat charge, just if you connect, you pay this and we'll deal with all the complexities as the utility? Or do we study? What we do for wind and solar generators, unfortunately, is that we study for 3 or 4 years whether this one or that project has to have a $10 million or $20 million charge to connect to the grid, where if we had just said, all right, everybody just pays 15 and that would be done with it, we could have been integrating a whole lot more over these last few years. And I would think and expect on the demand side with new loads, charging stations, that's certainly true for data centers, that if we can simplify that and just say, all right, utilities connect people, here's this kind of standard rate. And then sort of long-term, to manage the rates for everybody, the more we can increase the utilization of the whole set of infrastructure, then the lower the rates are for everybody, right? If we're all using electricity at the exact same time, well then guess what? We need to build out this massive transmission, distribution, et cetera, generation infrastructure, and then we all have a lot more to pay, so we're all paying more. But if we can manage the timing, and sometimes pricing helps for peak, off-peak pricing, et cetera, then that can increase the utilization. And that's, of course, easier to do with, I think, larger, more sophisticated customers. Not so easy with us. Even I am a dumb retail energy user at home, and I prefer it that way. And I think everybody would just like to have a simple, okay, if I use power between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m., maybe I get a solar discount now because there's a lot of solar power in the midday. But at any rate, make it simple for people who aren't going to keep track of the price every hour. But if we can give people an incentive, a discount, a rebate for using power at certain times, that could help the utilization.
Well, here, I thought this was a really simple issue, but we've now covered marginal cost and other terms that I haven't heard since microeconomics. So thank you. Thank you very much. But speaking of not being easy, there is a fundamental tension at the intersection of making this transition equitable and making this transition profitable. We're talking about, how can we kind of make it possible, but there is a real question of how can we also make it profitable. Do we think it's possible to have open and candid conversations about that tension? And can we maybe talk about why it is or isn't, or what are kind of whether you're talking about the pace of rollout, what is feasible, or the different factors involved?
I'm looking at Bia. I definitely have something to say about this, but wanted to.
No, please.
Okay. I think the challenge, and this is kind of what I was alluding to, is that in the end, if it's profitable for the company right now, it's probably not affordable for the customer. So you have this weird trade-off between, either the company's making money or the consumer is actually benefiting financially from the shift to electric. And I think that's really a challenge. And part of this issue is like, okay, yes, companies need to make money, but there is the challenge that there's just not enough competition at this point to really help drive down costs. And so part of the lack of competition is this lack of transparency. You don't know what you're going to be paying at the pump when you go to charge your vehicle. And there's like, you drive down the street, you see a million different signs. Oh, it's $3 per gallon, $4. Oh, I'll go to the $3 one instead of the $4 one. Super easy. But with electric vehicles, you do not have that option, right? You have to I'm going to look on the web, see, maybe. Then you show up and it's like a totally different price than what you were expecting, or it doesn't tell you until you already started charging. Are you being charged by the kilowatt hour, by the kilowatt, or by the hour? Like, there's so many different ways of pricing, and it's also not transparent, that it can just make it really hard, and that in the end, a lot of people thought it would be cheaper to go to EVs, but that's not what they're finding. And so I think that in the short run, some policies can be implemented that can sort of bridge that gap. One thing I like about the NEVI funds is that they require this sort of 5-year operation and maintenance benefit to the operator. So even though they're losing out because they don't have a lot of throughput, and so they're paying more per kilowatt hour that's going out than they're getting in, the state needs to subsidize them for the first 5 years and over that operations and maintenance. So that's a really great way to bridge that gap. But I think another option also would be, particularly for lower income EV owners, do something like a gas card, right? Like, I don't know if you guys remember when prices were really high a few years back over the summer in California. The governor implemented these gas cards where you were getting like a credit card that had money that you could go and use at the pump. Something similar like that, just for low income EV owners, so that they can pay those extra prices that they're facing at the pump, at the charger, and it wouldn't heavily distort the market because the cards wouldn't be going out to everybody, and so it wouldn't be a way for the operators to really be able to jack up their prices in response. So I think there's policy solutions that you can do to bridge that gap in the short run.
There's also technology solutions as well. We have the Ford Pass app where you can actually go in, drill down to which charger you want to look at or go to, but it does tell you the pricing. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to help consumers along the way, providing technology to assist in areas like that.
There's, I'm going to show you guys these federal minimum standards, and it's going to change your world. There's, part of the minimum standards is price transparency. So every publicly funded federal EV charger has to have price per kilowatt. Now, that doesn't mean much, just to be clear to folks here and now in the first or second or third year of the EV revolution, but it will going forward. So now, anytime you have a NEVI or CFI or ATC-MTD or pick your Title 23 charging program, there has to be price transparency, either on an app or on a billboard, just like you would experience at a convenience station. Look, I think we also have to be real about the challenge. Commodities are not terribly profitable. Even the gas station experience is not terribly profitable. It's a marginal business where people don't necessarily make money on the fuel per se, but on the amenities ancillary to the fuel. That's not terribly different than the electrification experiences as well, where folks aren't making a ton of money on the electricity, and that's something that we impressed as part of our negotiations to develop the $7.5 billion for charging infrastructure. It's for buying that pack of gum or buying that soda at a convenience station. So I think what Bea was talking about improving sort of the customer experience is going to be so critical to making sure that you get not only butts in seats but butts at charging stations, so that we drive up profitability for those businesses.
Thank you. All right. So To date, and this is reflected in our conversation, reflected in the policy, a lot of time has been devoted to light-duty vehicles. Could we talk a little bit about what you think is next? Whether that's in the direction of micro-mobility, whether we're talking about medium and heavy-duty vehicles. Could you guys comment on what you think kind of the next frontier is?
Sure, I can start there. I think there's a lot of promise with the medium and heavy-duty sector, particularly because the cost of ownership. The owners of the medium-duty and heavy-duty type vehicles, they understand they're running businesses, so they understand the cost of ownership. And so one of the things I think that we need to do is making sure that we can get them the vehicles that they need, the technology in terms of telematics, services that they need, and that's something that our Ford Pro team is working hard at every day. So they provide an end-to-end solution for our commercial vehicle customers, where there's financing, it's the vehicle type, it's the telematics solutions, and not only for Ford vehicles, but the telematics can work across their fleet, so across multiple manufacturers. And so we pull these solutions together for the medium to heavy duty customers to make sure that they can be successful. Where we need help and we need to work together on is ensuring that once the vehicle, commercial vehicle owner orders their vehicle, it'll take a certain amount of time for them to order the vehicle, get it upfit or whatnot, and then the vehicle's delivered. That time needs to align with the depot charging as well. And so when the permits, the design and the permitting and all that goes into the depot that they need to charge their vehicles, that timeline needs to align with the vehicle ordering process. There's a gap right now, but that's something that we continue to work with utilities on and the like. But the permitting and the implementation, the installation of the stations, that timing needs to come down a significant amount and align with that vehicle ordering process. Because if it's not aligned, then they can't run their business. And so we have to make sure that our commercial customers can run their business and providing solutions for them to do so. So lots of promise though, because again, they really understand that total cost of ownership and they're willing to make that leap.
Sure, I'll chime in. Given current battery technology and market availability, electrification is the practical solution for our parcel pickup and delivery vehicles. And even our off-road vehicle equipment, like our ground service equipment at airports. With that being said, though, for larger vehicle classes, we are looking at things beyond electrification, such as biofuels, and as we try to pursue our carbon neutral operation goals. And while looking at these alternatives, we still are engaging in purchasing heavy-duty electric vehicles. FedEx Freight in 2023 and in the first half of 2024 purchased, I believe, 36 Class 7 heavy-duty vehicles. In addition to that, in the UK, we have transitioned from diesel to biofuel. So in pursuit of our carbon neutral operation goals, we're looking at a holistic approach, also recognizing some of the challenges that come with the different type of vehicles.
We can go to the EPA together on that. We think there's a lot of promise too in biofuels, especially for the car park. And if we're looking at overall carbon neutral goals, that reduction can be significant. Also, we're looking at fuel cell electric vehicles as well to help for that longer term, or that longer drive. Yep. So that's something that we're researching at Ford. We won a DOE project for $25 million, where we actually will have 5 pilot vehicles that we're bringing to market in early next year to showcase with partners how fuel cell vehicles could work as a solution for the future.
Write that down.
Jordan, I would just say, one other aspect of this, since we're talking about equity, is that medium and heavy duty vehicles constitute about 10% or less of the fleet that's out on the roadways today, yet contribute about a quarter of emissions. And who does that hurt? That hurts marginalized communities. folks that live adjacent to port facilities, airport facilities, and other transportation facilities. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to look for ways to support not just light duty electrification, but medium and heavy duty electrification as well. There's a independent organization called NACFE. Their only purpose is to provide technical analysis as to a way forward on all fuel types, and they've shown how to do that for medium and heavy duty fleets, and as a result, Pepsi and a lot of other companies have taken up their technical assistance. Within the federal aperture, there's also specific targeted programs for medium and heavy duty fleets. We've talked a little bit about NEVI, which is a formalized program that goes out to all 50 states, DC and Puerto Rico. There's also the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Program. The US Department of Transportation is currently reviewing those applications, and there's a priority consideration for medium and heavy duty vehicles as part of that $2.5 billion program. If you move over to EPA, EPA has a Clean Ports program specifically for vehicles that are entering or within a port facility. There's a Reducing Truck Emission Port program. There's all sorts of programs for medium and heavy duty vehicles because we're here. The time is now. We don't have to wait till next year, 5 years, 10 years down the road. So I just want to answer your question very directly that there's absolutely a business proposition for medium and heavy duty vehicles. The federal government is providing that additional support for gap filling purposes going forward.
Thank you.
I also want to just agree with everything that everybody has said so far, really important, but you brought up micromobility, and I think that's something that should be a key part of our strategy here, because I really think that this is the time that we can leverage these massive investments to really reimagine mobility and how we move around, right? Our hyper focus on vehicle electrification is just not enough to decarbonize the transportation system. We have to get people out of the cars, get them walking, biking, into public transit, right? Another yet important reason why the heavy-duty vehicles need to be electric. That includes the buses. But in terms of micromobility, this can be a pretty low-cost way to improve mobility in a decarbonized manner. So I mean, there's a lot of transit deserts out there, and interestingly, I live in New York City, and I think it's funny because everyone's like, oh, New York City has such great public transit, but actually it's a nightmare because the way that the city was built up was in a very racist manner. All of the above ground trams that used to exist were wiped out in favor of subway systems that took everybody into Manhattan. So if you live in Queens, to go to other parts of Queens, or you live in Brooklyn, to go to Queens, it takes you forever. So you can be in a part of Queens that would take you an hour and a half to get to a different part of Queens that would have taken you 10 minutes in car. So you have to go all the way into Manhattan, you have to transfer it all the way back. And there's no e-mobility there. There's no micro-mobility, right? There's no scooters, bikes, because City Bike has determined that this is outside of their limit of area. And so you have these horrible transit deserts where people just don't have a lot of good public transit, right? And they don't have this micro-mobility. But extending out that micro-mobility options would be hugely beneficial and so much cheaper than trying to put in an above-ground tram or trying to put in an extra subway station. And I think that this is a challenge because a lot of cities are like, oh, well, these shared bikes, they're actually not very profitable, and a lot of times the cities have to subsidize them, which is kind of unfortunate. But I mean, if we talk about subsidizing that versus, paying billions of dollars and expanding the subway system, I think this could be a good alternative.
Thank you. All right. Well, we are about at the time where we're going to switch over and we'll take some questions from the audience. But as our team gets prepared with the microphones and as you think about your questions, I will ask each of you to think about I'm not going to say your favorite incentive, but what do you think is the most effective incentive that's in play right now? We've talked about, both the infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, they're largely using incentives to try and shift focus. What do you think is the most effective incentive in play right now?
For me, it's incentives that go directly to consumer at the time of purchase. I think that benefits the consumer hugely, and also the automakers to get the vehicles out there sooner.
Absolutely agree with Cynthia. Maybe just to build off of that, we talk a lot about a $7,500 tax credit for electric vehicles, which is incredibly important and incredibly helpful and an incredible win for this country. But in addition, there's also a $4,000 tax credit for used vehicles. And just given the topic, again, on equity, that is such a critical lever that we need to do a better job of socializing and making sure that marginalized communities are aware of that tax credit as well. It's less sexy, but extraordinarily important so that we can decrease the chasm between the haves and have-nots.
The Clean School Bus program has actually been wildly successful, but so it provides a huge subsidy for school districts to go electric. Unfortunately, electric school bus prices are absurdly, outrageously expensive compared to their diesel alternative. And I think part of that is due to the fact that these subsidies are just a little too generous, and so the manufacturers are taking in that incentive for their own benefit. So I think that the question is, can we have really successful subsidy programs while at the same time keeping costs down? I think that's a balance that we need to be able to strike better.
I'm not going to name a favorite incentive. I'm going to name an attribute that makes incentives successful. I think partnership and collaboration between critical stakeholders is how we move forward. So I would advocate that whatever policy directions that are put forward, that you bring all critical stakeholders in so they can weigh in.
I'll interpret the question broadly to include power sector and transmission. There's one new program in the IIJA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, called a Transmission Facilitation Program. And what this is we have these, if you have a long line across many states, the challenge is very often, well, who pays for it? If everybody benefits across 15 states, then it's a classic public good problem. So everybody argues and the things usually just don't get built. This is a program with the new Grid Deployment Office at the Department of Energy will come in and be the anchor tenant, take a quarter or to a third of the total cost off the table, and then you still have to allocate the costs of the remaining, say, 2/3, but at least your whole problem just got 1/3 easier than it was before, and the developers love it. You have transmission developers around the country who now have experience with this, and it's really working well. So it was only funded at $2.5 billion as a revolving fund. You have to pay the money back. But that could be, if I could significantly expand one in any future budget bill, that would be the one.
Fantastic. Don't often hear $2.5 billion referred to with only, but
Transmission, that is about a month's worth of national spending, so it's not very much.
All right. Terrific. So we will now turn, Madison has a microphone for anyone who has any questions. Okay, terrific. We will start up front and then we'll move to Jay next. Okay, thank you, Sarah.
Yes, thank you. I'm curious, building on the transparency and consumer focus we had earlier, what, if any, role do you see for the rental car market in increasing consumer use and acceptance of electric vehicles? And I ask this having had a lot of recent experience, both domestically and abroad, in renting cars and recognizing the cheapest cars available were electric cars. I don't own one, but there was no information readily available to bridge the gap. Do I have to bring the car back full? Is there a charger? If I don't know how to charge, can somebody show me that? So that's the context for the question. With a little bit of bias towards the idea, it would be a great way for people to experiment with what it's like to drive an electric vehicle. Your name? Oh, my name is Frankenstein.
Kathy, I think that would be a huge opportunity to educate consumers on electric vehicles. But I think the first thing that we would have to do is educate the rental car companies. Because I'll tell you, I've been in a line. I've been in a line twice behind a couple folks that were bringing back an electric vehicle, and they turned around to me and said, "Don't get the electric vehicle." I'm like, wait a minute. I work in sustainability at Ford. Tell me more why you're saying that. And so I think it's critical that we must educate the rental car companies. So we must take them through a boot camp to show them the benefits of the electric vehicles themselves, to show them how to charge the vehicles up before they give them to the consumers, because that was one of the issues. But again, it's going to take a lot of education for us to get there, but I think it'll be a huge opportunity for folks to try the vehicles before they actually go out and buy them themselves.
Thank you. Jay, I think you were next.
Thank you. Jay Pendergrass with the Environmental Law Institute. So to the speed of building out versus the how do you manage equity, because there has been a lot of discussion about the need to do this transition quickly. Some people that I really respect are saying we need to do away with environmental impact assessments in order to do permitting quickly. But in order to get environmental justice and equity issues done correctly, you need to do that on a retail level. You have to be talking to people in the communities, and that takes time. So how do we get to be able to accomplish these goals, both goals of which are important?
So I think that there's probably like some decoupling within your question, just from my perspective. It's a great question, but I think that there's some decoupling that's needed. So let's start here. Over 98% of federal aid projects are what's called categorically excluded from NEPA, meaning they don't have to do an environmental impact statement or an environmental assessment. They're categorically excluded. Why are they categorically excluded? Maybe the ground has already been disturbed, so anything on the right-of-way has a categorical exclusion. Maybe it's within the existing footprint, which is why you see, during bridge disasters, a lot of bridges get repaired so quickly, and the governor is able to, cut a ribbon as soon as possible. It's also because of spotlighting issues. There's a lot of spotlights, but it's also because of categorical exclusions. Similarly, most all EV charging infrastructure pre-2021 was on highway rights-of-way, which were categorically excluded. But it turned out that a lot of people wanted to deploy charging infrastructure in libraries, at grocery stores and shopping centers and parking lots, and that wasn't necessarily seen as on the right-of-way. So the Federal Highway Administration, in coordination with the Department of Energy, created a new categorical exclusion so that 100% of EV charging infrastructure projects that are federally funded, it's not that they don't have to go through NEPA, that's a misnomer, but they are categorically excluded. So it's essentially a 1 to 2 page piece of paper that shows why there is a categorical exclusion. I think the reason why I mentioned decoupling is because I think that is a totally separate issue from the issue that Bea brought up, which is the procedural justice issue at the beginning of her remarks. There's absolutely a need for community engagement, which is why all 52 jurisdictions, as part of the NEVI process, submitted a community engagement plan. There was one state, now I can talk about this a little more freely in my private in my private capacity. There was one state, the state of Indiana, which did encounter some issues with their local NAACP chapter, but through that community engagement process, they were able to submit a community engagement plan, just like every other state across the country. That is absolutely needed, and totally agree, critical going forward. That's how we build commercially scaled projects here in the United States going forward. Regardless of whether they're categorically excluded or not, there needs to be community engagement as part of these projects so that there's buy-in as to whether you need the project or not, because they have generational impacts, whether it's a EV charging deployment or some other transportation facet.
I'll also just say that, we're not doing this very fast, right? We're not deploying very quickly. I mean, if we're being honest with ourselves. And so that does open up an opportunity for us to, in parallel, create these, community engagement plans and really begin to figure out, like, how do we do this in a slightly more wholesale manner at the city level, right? Like, does the city have plans in place to figure out how to talk to the different communities that they need to deal with when they're going to go in and put in these charging stations? So, it requires a lot of coordination and a lot of willingness on the part of the city to create these types of plans and actually carry them through and have it not just be performative, right? Like, oh, we're going to have a town hall where people can come and express their concerns and we're done, we engage the community. I think it does require an effort and a willingness to do it, but we can sort of do it in parallel as the utilities are sort of figuring out, do we have the capacity as we're dealing with the slog of the supply chain constraints and stuff like that.
I'm going to offer, at the risk of revealing total ignorance about transportation altogether, I'm very curious about these very small-scale distributed chargers that you can put in neighborhoods. They must be level 2, the lower, not fast charging, but you can put, thousands of them around, and they're easier to access where there's street parking, because those are not massive pieces of infrastructure investment that require, a choice of which is the best location. It's just you put them everywhere. My other panelists may know or may not. I think they have them in New York. They're going around, and they're getting some public funding.
I think they can work for some applications, but when we look at our commercial vehicle customers, they would be too expensive, and they need to be too large to handle those applications. But in some cases, they, for public charging, for light duty vehicles.
Just retail, non-commercial use, I would think.
I mean, those level 2 chargers are super important, and particularly because charging with fast chargers really degrades the batteries. So, having access to level 2 charging near where you live, where you can charge overnight, is really important to making sure that you have that, lower cost, as it's cheaper to recharge at level 2, and it's not so harmful for your batteries. So I think it's really important.
And I do know a little about the utility industry. They take a long time, and it's hard to get the big infrastructure. You got to get a, higher voltage connection to a fast charging station. But these level 2s, it's like putting a 500 clothes dryers around a neighborhood. You don't need a permit for that. They don't even know. They don't even care.
Well, it's actually really interesting. There's this one company called It's Electric, which is a startup company. The founder is actually Brooklyn-based. But so what It's Electric does is it goes to a property owner. It could be a building or a homeowner, and basically finds out, do you have excess capacity on your electric panel? And if so, basically what they'll do is they'll run a cable from your panel. They'll dig out underneath your sidewalk and put in a public charging station in front of your home. And I could do it, for example, if I wanted to, or any sort of building owner could do it. You have this built up, and then the people who charge, they face a fixed price, which is some amount above the residential rate, and so that It's Electric will actually share the profits with the homeowner, which is a really great solution because It's Electric is sort of doing this at the city level. There are actually permits. You can't just put it in. You have you have to get the right of way with the Department of Transportation, city level. There's all these red tape that they have to go through, but because, they're sort of doing it centralized, they're able to get that red tape for a city at large. Right now, they're trying to break into New York City. But it also provides an opportunity for homeowners to sort of begin to benefit from that ownership of charging stations, which I think is an interesting solution.
Thank you. That is the company I was thinking of, and I couldn't remember the name of it, so that helps.
At the risk of making this the longest answer to a question in history, just one other thought, because I think it's the right question we need to ask, which is, why is it taking so long? It takes a lot of other transportation projects a long time to deploy, but in the case of EV charging infrastructure, why is it still taking as long? It's not necessarily the environmental process at the federal level. It could be the case that there's a lot of permitting issues at a local and state level. That is one of the biggest complaints that there is. It also takes a long time to furnish a grant agreement. So after the signing of an award and the award announcement and all of the acclaim, then there has to be an agreement between the State Department of Transportation and the private entity. That can take anywhere from a year to 18 months before you actually have chargers in the ground, before you go through all of the legal gymnastics. I'm, at risk of always faulting state departments of transportation. They have become state departments of everything. So they're deploying a lot of different, furniture on our national highway system. But I would say we have to think about reprioritizing grant agreements to get those done quicker, which means something else has to fall off. And I think that points to some of the tension in your question.
Thank you. Okay, I think we had, yes, in the back, and then we'll come, I pause, the houndstooth jacket, and then Maddie, you'll be third. Okay, yes.
Hi, thank you so much for a really wonderful panel. I extremely enjoyed this. My name is Achinthi Vithanage. I direct the environmental law program at Pace University Law School. My question responds, tops off what Cynthia mentioned regarding responsible mining. And I was curious because in 2021, Ford was the first US automobile manufacturer that joined IRMA, which is the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. And IRMA sets voluntary standards for responsible mining. And of course, there's always healthy skepticism around voluntary standards and how effective they are vis-a-vis, regulations, etc., other influences like regulations. So I'm curious, from your perspective at Ford, how significant and impactful has it been to be part of IRMA standards, and have you seen a really great impact in terms of how you approach human rights issues, equity issues in your mining sector with respect to how it contributes to EVs?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I think it's been a huge benefit to be part of IRMA. And we actually take pieces of the IRMA strategy and put that into contracts that we make with the mining areas. But huge benefit, I think IRMA and also RMA, I think being part of both of those have huge impacts on our strategy and the way we lay out our strategy with our partners. I think it's going to be huge impact, not only for Ford, but also, as you say, the way, looking at the way people work in that industry. And so I think it'll be a huge impact for Ford as well as the supply chain.
Thank you. All right, next, do you still have a question? Yes? Yeah, yes, terrific. Thank you, Sarah.
Hi, my name is Niping, and I'm a PhD student from University in Maryland, and I'm also the researcher for the Build American Center. And recently, we are still focusing on the equity analysis framework, as the Bea said. Yes, because right now for the project, especially for the state government, when they try to apply for the funds from the federal government, when they identify the equity, they just use the location, such as EGS tools, to identify if this EV charge station in the disadvantaged area. And this analysis process may be a little bit simple, as you said. So I'm just curious, do you have any suggestions or your own opinions about the framework? or how can we build the framework more comprehensive and more usable or effective for those projects?
Great question. So I think that the challenge is that these answers are really place specific, right? So what's going to work in one location isn't going to work in another location. And so the city governments, right, need to start thinking about what does the distribution of charging stations and EV ownership look like in my jurisdiction, and where do we want to go with that, right? So if you have specific goals about EV ownership and you think that, for example, that the charging station placement is going to drive EV ownership, you know, that's only a part of the way, right? You're only going to get a little bit of movement just by placing charging stations in locations to be able to boost demand, right? There's all these other things that you're going to have to do to increase EV demand in the places that are lagging behind. So I know that doesn't really answer your question specifically about the framework, but you know, we do provide this discussion in this paper that I was telling you about that we published over the summer. The first step is to consider what's the landscape where you're in, right? What are the harms that the individuals in underserved and overburdened communities face? How have the, you know, different discriminatory actions within different sectors, the transportation sector, the housing sector, how have those resulted in the current inequities that you currently face? Right? And that's going to differ place by place. So in some places, right, mobility in these communities is very, very low. And so if you think about, like, you know, asking the question of, are these charging stations going to increase mobility, right? Maybe if you co-locate them with micro-mobility, or maybe if you say, we're going to focus on putting in en route charging for electric bus routes, rather than we're going to focus on putting in light-duty vehicle charging stations, right? So it depends on what the goal is of the city, but I think that if the city really does have a goal of let's reduce the inequities within the transportation sector, and they view the charging station as one approach to doing it, they have to be a lot more expansive in thinking about how do these investments really move the needle in terms of improving the livelihoods of these individuals. One of the things that, you know, we haven't really talked about too much, and I sort of alluded to it in the last thing I said about It's Electric, is like ownership of charging stations, right? Like who's actually set up to profit. And I mentioned like most charging operators not profiting now, but they will in the future. So who are we, you know, in terms of economic development and wealth generation, right? Are we putting it in the hands of people who otherwise wouldn't have it, right? Or are we just letting the multinational, kind of the very large charging station companies come in and do everything, right? Because that's easy to do. They're the ones who know how to take advantage of the subsidies and so on. You know, boosting competition in that space and bringing ownership into the hands of you know, homeowners, business owners, smaller groups. So there's different approaches, and I would definitely encourage you to read the paper.
Can I build on one point about the ownership? We haven't talked about that much, but this is important in the utility sector because utilities tend to, in any sector, tend to want to take their regulated franchise monopoly and extend it to upstream, downstream, side stream sectors, right, and make money off of that and use their exclusive, you know, government-granted franchise on the utility sector to make money in these other sectors. Well, that's been an issue in the electric industry after we deregulated, you know, airlines and trucking and lots of other things. We did it a little bit in electricity where we decided the economist profession, RFF, and other economists around the country said, but, you know, it turns out that generation is actually a very structurally competitive sector. Let's leave that to competition, but the transmission and distribution, leave that for the utilities. Well, what we're seeing now with EV charging stations is the utilities want to say, hey, that's a nice piece of property. We'd like to own that. When anybody could enter that business. It's not structurally natural monopoly at all. So I think it is something to keep an eye out, particularly for the regulatory lawyers and antitrust types in the room. This is an area where the old, I think it was from the old Baxter AT&T breakup case of the mantra of quarantine the monopoly, right? So keep the utility in their monopoly space, don't let them extend that, and try to own these other related sectors.
Thank you, Rob. All right. Maddie.
Hello, I'm Matty Stanislaus. I'm a board member of ELI. Somewhat related to the IRMA question, but also the broader scale-up of the supply chain. The European Commission has adopted product passports as a mechanism to look at responsible sourcing, circularity. Global Barrier Alliance is implementing that in a proof of concept. There are discussions on the Hill about adopting that, more of a direct data mechanism, cross-supply mechanism to look at compliance with responsible sourcing, greenhouse gas footprint, and other kind of metrics. So any thoughts about a vehicle like that, or buying into kind of a global instrument like that to adhere these compliance with these requirements?
My only thing is to harmonize. Okay, if harmonization. If they're going to adopt the standard that's coming out in Europe. Don't just pick and choose and do a unique one. I think that's where we get caught up in wanting to be the best of everything. To me, to get more of these electric vehicles out into the community, we need more harmonization of requirements altogether. Between China, the US, Europe, we need harmonization, and that's all we ask for. We play in Europe as well, and we're adhering to all the regulations in Europe. And Ford will be one of the first ones that actually report out on the corporate sustainability directive that they have. And so we're all about responding to the regulation, but all we ask is harmonization. If we could just have one requirement that we can utilize to enter the markets around the globe.
I'll just also add that I think the battery passport is a really exciting opportunity because, from the mining perspective, if you implement, like effective and equitable community engagement around the mine, and you really do this well, and you reduce your impact on the communities and the environment, you're not going to get paid more, right? And there's this. You do not get a premium on your minerals because you've done something well. And so by having the battery passport, you can really highlight that, and it can allow the mineral producers to actually get a premium because it gets all the way through to the end user. Because otherwise there's just no link there, right? I go to buy an EV, I have absolutely no idea whether or not the minerals were taken out in a sustainable manner unless we have something like the battery passport. And then we can start to get that economic incentive for mineral producers to actually do the right thing.
Or unless you buy a Ford.
I think we have time for one more question if anyone has. All right,
Betty Kocher. I'm just wondering if you can tell me, are there any urban areas in the United States where there are publicly available EV stations? I've been in Europe, I've been in Paris, I've seen them on the streets as just like parking meters. I was just in Texas and I went to a Buc-ee's gas station or something, and there were maybe 20 charging stations there. I have not seen anything other than in Washington specifically, other than in privately owned or in Giant or Safeway or something. Is there any plan? Is there any intention? Does it exist already to have them publicly available on the streets like I saw in Paris?
Yeah, I feel like you're giving us a layup to close. The answer is absolutely, and that's the whole. Yeah, that's the whole point of the president's effort to deploy, $7.5 billion just for charging infrastructure, $100 billion for EV charging infrastructure eligibility just at USDOT, $300 billion once you include EPA, Treasury, and other programs across the interagency. And then where they're sprouting up in communities across the country because of awards. Yeah, sure. I mean, New York City, as a result of the bipartisan infrastructure law, has deployed hundreds of chargers right in New York City proper for level 2, exactly what Bea was talking about. Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Miami, Louisville, Los Angeles. It's hard to name cities because so many cities. It's a great moment to continue education, which I think is part of the role that ELI plays. That this is happening right now, right underneath our feet. This, so-called EV revolution is, 5 years ago, we never had a EV grant program, and all of a sudden we have billions of dollars that are going out in real time to communities across the country, particularly urban cores and rural areas to gap fill where the private sector otherwise wouldn't find it financially viable to do.
And it is harder to do curbside charging, just mainly because of the red tape that I was talking about. But if you go to chargehub.com, you can get a view. Chargehub.com, you can get a view of all the public charging stations all over the country, and there's really quite a lot.
And just to make it simple, if you buy a Ford, we'll connect you with the Ford Pass app, and you can just go to your app and you can look and see where you can charge publicly.
The first lady who asked the question about rental cars, I had that experience this year too. I got talked in Arizona into renting electric, and we were cursing it because you were supposed to bring it back fully charged, and anyway, it's not easy.
Buy a Ford, read the paper, use FedEx.
So thank you. I think that is the end of the Q&A portion. I think we now just have time for, I'm going to say, a wrap-up comment from each of you. This could be either the biggest opportunity you see before us in the transportation infrastructure space, the biggest obstacle, or just a point that you would like people to take away from this conversation. So Cynthia, maybe we could begin with you.
For me, I think it's more of working together so that we can make sure that the infrastructure is there in place for our customers, for public as retail, as well as our commercial vehicle customers. Again, working together, let's overcome these obstacles together, and let's get the charging infrastructure out there fast. I think that's the moral of the story for me. Thank you.
An early congratulations to Cynthia on her award. Jordan, thanks so much for facilitating this discussion. It's such an honor to be here with my other panelists. I think anytime we have an electrification conversation, it's important to zoom out and think about what it is that we want to accomplish. And from a decarbonization perspective, we want to do essentially 4 things. We want to reduce trips, we want to shift trips, we want to improve trips, and ultimately we want to negate emissions. One way that we want to reduce trips is through active transportation, walking, biking, micromobility. One way we want to shift trips is by promoting more rail use, more transit use. That's why we have the most rail investment since the inception of Amtrak, the most transit investment in our nation's history. One way that we want to improve trips is through this electrification discussion that we're having, and we obviously want to make that more equitable. And one way that we want to negate emissions is by really reconceiving what it means to have a transportation right-of-way, not where you're just trying to minimize emissions, but where you're trying to have a positive emissions profile on your transportation system. That includes things like natural infrastructure, for instance. I think if we look at our system from a system of systems perspective, and sort of in that frame, we can put electrification as a piece of the story, again, as necessary, but certainly not sufficient. Oftentimes I hear either one mode of transportation or another. I don't think it ever has to be either or. I think it can be both and if we're all in the same, if we all have the same goal of getting to net zero emissions.
Yeah, I think, I just want to talk a little bit about was the biggest obstacle, what I think is the biggest obstacle to actually developing, this infrastructure network equitably is really kind of what Cynthia was talking about. It is that it is going to require a lot of coordination. And it requires coordination across a multitude of stakeholders who often do not see eye to eye, who have their own interests. And it requires us to be creative and sort of open to different pathways, right? And because everybody has their own goals and everybody has their own profit motivation, it's like not many people are really open to, cooperation or finding pathways that elevate equity. And so I think that it requires a big push from policymakers to say, what are the structures, the systems that we can put in place to promote that coordination and to guide the pathway to something equitable. Just having a free-for-all is just not going to get us, it might get us there fast, but it's not going to get us there in an equitable manner. I think it's exciting that we do require coordination and integration across the different industries, but that's probably going to be the biggest thing challenging us to achieving it.
FedEx has been intentional in setting our carbon neutral goals. We've been intentional in our deployment of electric vehicles. We've been intentional in looking for opportunities that will further our carbon neutral goals. I think, like echoing what everyone else said on the panel, the realization that while time is a concern, that we need to work together as stakeholders and to find a solution to this issue. And that's the only way we're going to get there, is being together and being open and communicating about the challenges that each of us face and trying to seek the middle ground. Otherwise, we'll be spinning our wheels. It's not necessarily where we want to be. So.
Well, I'll just, as an EV owner, I'll just cheer for all of you trying to get these stations out, because I can do 99% of what I do around town with my level 2 at home. But when I go on the highway and I look on the app and then I see, oh, there's a station, then I show up and actually that one's actually not open, it's just broken. And then I'm really stuck. So the highway experience is really not good. If you can tolerate Elon Musk, you can be on that network, and that's a good one, but the other one's not so good yet. And then I would just say, as we look to the next Congress, obviously political scenarios matter, but the grid is important. It actually got very little money in the overall IIJA and IRA, and so I think from a decarbonization perspective, we really need to look at grid funding. Again, some very good programs that I like, but they weren't given many dollars. They were kind of an afterthought late in the process. And so if we get another bite at that apple, I think that's a good place to look.
I'll just say the Ford Power Promise will come get you and get you that charge you need.
Well, with that, we are drawing to a close. I want to say a huge thank you to our 5 panelists for being here and being present in this conversation and not giving sound bites, but really responding to each other. I hope at the beginning of this conversation, Joel highlighted 3 principles that he saw kind of Nancy or Judge Firestone embodying. Great listening. I want to thank you guys for listening to each other. I'll thank all of you for listening to us. I think the second was understanding the purpose of what you're doing, and I think that was really evident and kind of at the heart of all of the comments today of why are we doing this? Why is this the move that we're trying to make? And then simple and clear explanations. Well, these aren't simple and clear issues, but I think you really boiled down some of the complexities to, again, center on kind of the how and why now. So thank you. Thank you again to Pat for making this possible. Thank you to Judge Firestone for inspiring this. And thank you all for being here today. The reception will begin in just a moment. We will open up the doors. And if you are joining us for the award dinner tonight, there will be folks to direct you down to the reception. Or if you won't be joining us for the dinner tonight, then we hope to see you at the 3rd annual Firestone Policy Forum, same time next year. Okay. Thank you.